Margaret's story began as a tragedy long before she understood the weight of it. It was 1443 when she was born at Bleo Castle in Bedfordshire, a place soon to be stained by the future that awaited her. From the moment she took her first breath, Margaret wasn't just a child. She was property. Her father, John Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, one of the wealthiest men in England, didn't see her as his daughter, but as a commodity. At only 1 year old, a shift in the castle's hall sealed her fate. Her father, under mysterious circumstances, was found dead. The whispers spread fast, suicide. But the truth of that day didn't matter to Margaret. What did matter was what came next. Her father's death turned her from a mere baby into a prize that would determine the future of an empire. Her mother, Margaret Khan, tried to keep her safe. She protected her daughter and ensured that Margaret received the education and care a child of her status deserved. But that didn't last. The king had plans of his own. At just 3 years old, Margaret was handed over as a political tool. King Henry VI gave her away to William de Pole, Duke of Suffolk. And just like that, her life was decided for her. Suffolk wasted no time. He married his 3-year-old son to her in a ceremony that left a mark on history. It wasn't just a political union. It was a child's life traded away in plain sight, and no one batted an eye. But the story takes a darker turn. Suffolk's plans failed. In 1453, he was arrested and murdered. And suddenly, Margaret found herself, once again, up for grabs. King Henry VI, now with an opportunity, made a fateful decision. He handed Margaret over to the Tudor brothers, Edmund and Jasper. Edmund Tudor, a ruthless man with his eyes set on securing his fortune, married Margaret when she was just 12 years old. But he didn't wait. In a cruel, calculated move, he took her innocence before the age of consent, exploiting the very young girl he married. Why? Because in medieval law, a young bride's lands would go to her family if she died without children. But if she had a child, her husband inherited everything. Edmund, cold and calculating, knew exactly what he was doing. He impregnated her while she was still a child, not yet fully grown, knowing the risks, but indifferent to them. He wanted his fortune, no matter the cost to her life. Margaret, now 13, pregnant and alone, was trapped. When Edmund was captured and killed during the Wars of the Roses, Margaret found herself with no one left. With the war raging and her young body already carrying a child she never asked for, she made a bold decision. She traveled across the war-torn country to place herself under the protection of Jasper Tudor. The journey was perilous. It could have killed her. But Margaret, even in her fragile state, wasn't going to be pushed around. She was done being a pawn in others' games. But this is where the story of Margaret Beaufort ends, not in triumph, not with her dreams fulfilled, but with the harsh reality of her life. The truth, buried for so long, is now coming to light, and history can't hide the pain she endured. Margaret's body was ruined by the greed of men. She became a symbol, not of a girl who had the chance to live, but of the countless others whose voices were silenced by the powerful forces around them. In the winter of 1457, Pembroke Castle became the stage for a horror no one would ever forget. Margaret Beaufort, barely 13 years old, writhed in agony as her body fought to give birth to a child she was never meant to have. Her body was too small, too young, to bear such a burden. Her bones hadn't finished growing, her hips too narrow to allow the child to pass through. Hours passed as the midwives, experienced but frightened, struggled to save both mother and baby. But it was a lost cause. Margaret wasn't a woman in labor. She was a child, whose body was being torn apart. The cries echoed through the cold halls of Pembroke, but there was no salvation in sight. The trauma of this birth, too brutal to be fully understood, left Margaret permanently scarred. And it wouldn't just be physical damage. This was the beginning of a long, painful journey for Margaret, one she would never fully escape. She had been forced into a marriage at 12, a child bride traded like a piece of property, and now her body was paying the price. This was no ordinary tragedy of medieval marriage customs. This was a story of greed and power, of men using a child to secure their own futures, and of a system that allowed her suffering to continue unchecked. When Edmund Tudor, a man twice her age, claimed her as his bride, he saw not a child, but an opportunity. a way to solidify his status, to secure his fortune. In the eyes of the powerful men around her, Margaret was nothing more than an asset. She was forced to carry a child for them. But even after enduring the impossible, Margaret's nightmare wasn't over. The baby survived Henry, the future king. But Margaret was left broken, her body never to recover. The birth, so damaging that she could never have another child, didn't just mark the end of Margaret's ability to have children. It marked the beginning of her torment. The physical pain was unbearable, and the psychological scars were even deeper. Margaret had been a pawn in a political game from the beginning, and it had cost her everything. And the story doesn't end there. Despite the damage done to her, Margaret fought to protect others from suffering the same fate. Decades later, when her granddaughter, Margaret Tudor, was betrothed to the King of Scotland at a young age, Margaret fought tooth and nail to prevent it. She knew the dangers. She knew the cost of being forced into marriage before your body was ready, and she did everything she could to stop history from repeating itself. But even Margaret's efforts couldn't stop the wheels of political power from turning. Margaret Tudor, just like her grandmother, was sent to Scotland at the age of 13. The same fate awaited her. The same cycle of pain and suffering continued. Margaret Beaufort's story is a stark reminder of the horrors of medieval England. It's a window into how power worked, how women's bodies were treated as commodities, and how the system, even when it caused unimaginable harm, continued unabated. Margaret never escaped the trauma of her youth, even as she rose to power, becoming a key figure in the Tudor dynasty. But no matter how much power she accumulated, she could never escape the memories of her past. Even after she had children of her own, even as she became the mother of a king, she could never escape the pain inflicted upon her body when she was just a child. The same system that used her for political gain continued to exploit others like her, and Margaret, in her position of power, couldn't protect them. She couldn't protect her granddaughter, just as she couldn't protect herself from the horrors of her own childhood. The story of Margaret Beaufort isn't just a historical tragedy. It's a window into a world where children were forced into marriages, where their bodies were sacrificed for the political ambitions of the powerful. It's a reminder that power, no matter how much it's accumulated, comes at a cost, and that cost is often paid by the most vulnerable. She was just 12. That simple fact is at the core of everything. In the grand history of the Tudor dynasty, amidst the pomp and power, it all began with a 12-year-old girl. A girl whose life almost ended because the very people who should have safeguarded her chose their own ambitions over her survival. This isn't just another royal tale. It's the chilling truth that lies beneath the grand narrative of the Tudor dynasty. The blood that stained the throne wasn't just metaphorical. It was real, and it was paid for by a child's innocence. Margaret Beaufort, a pawn in a political game, was used as a vessel for someone else's power. A dynasty built on the broken body of a 12-year-old girl who never had a say in her fate. Her name, her legacy, overshadowed by the price she paid. No one should ever forget that. Margaret was 12, and that was all it took for her life to be sacrificed for the ambitions of others. That truth is what history tries to forget, but it's the reality behind the throne, the cost of empire, and the tragedy of a girl who never got to be a child. Imagine the agony she endured, the struggle she fought for a life she never asked for. She was too young to understand, too young to consent, and yet her body was thrust into the service of the state. The consequences were catastrophic. She couldn't even recover from the damage inflicted on her, and in a time where women were expected to bear children, her pain was dismissed, overshadowed by the demands of the throne. And while history moves forward, the price Margaret paid is buried beneath the stories of glory. Her name becomes just a whisper, lost to time, and her sacrifice forgotten. But it was her blood, her suffering, that laid the foundation of the Tudor Empire. She was 12 years old, and that simple fact should have been enough to save her. Yet, in the end, no one spared her. No one protected her. Her body, her childhood, her future were all sacrificed. And the tragedy is, this wasn't just her story. It was the story of every girl forced into a system that exploited her, used her, and then cast her aside when she was no longer useful. Margaret Beaufort's legacy is the horror of what happens when children are treated as commodities. This isn't just about the Tudor dynasty. This is about the price of power and the human cost that comes with it. The truth is ugly, and it needs to be told. A 12-year-old girl shouldn't have been the price of a throne. And yet she was.